They laughed at him, you know, standing there in the shadow of 1,000 roaring engines and blaring speakers, leaning on that cane, weathered flight jacket hanging off his thin shoulders. Folks probably figured he was just some old-timer who used to drive the fuel truck. A couple of kids even cracked jokes about him loud enough to make sure he'd hear, probably just here for the free hot dogs. One snickered. The old man didn't bother turning, just narrowed his eyes at the shimmering runway as the crowd built into a living wall of anticipation. That's when the Warthog A-10 Thunderbolt roared to life for the crowd. And let me tell you, not a soul there thought to wonder why this man's hands shook ever so slightly, or why his eyes never left that plane for even a second. Nobody noticed the battered notebook pressed against his knuckles, full of dense sketches and numbers, or how his jaw clenched every time the announcer rattled off specs about the Avenger cannon he'd probably heard it all 1,000 times. Except, maybe, for the little girl who tugged at her dad's sleeve, pointing at those drawings before being hurried away with a whispered, "Don't bother him, honey." It stung a little, not because he wanted attention, but because he used to love explaining things to kids, passing on what he'd learned in a world that had already started forgetting. It was hot that day, one of those real American summers at Andrews Air Force Base. 50,000 folks crowded shoulder to shoulder for the air show. Families waving plastic pilot helmets, veterans in faded unit caps, and every eye waiting for the main event. The announcer was hyping up the Warthog, the tank killer that changed modern warfare. He boomed. The old man edged closer to the barrier, nodding politely to the teens with their phones out, ignoring their smirks. "My granddad flew those," he said to nobody in particular. One of the kids rolled his eyes. "Yeah, sure he did, Pops." Now, let me back up a sec. This guy wasn't just any old-timer. Back in the day, he was Colonel Jack Barnes, test pilot, engineer, and one of the architects of the A-10 itself. Not that anyone here had a clue, but it mattered to him, the way that aircraft was built from the ground up to save soldiers' lives, not just to set speed records or win beauty contests. His body still ached from a forced ejection over Kuwait decades ago. Those old wounds never really left, just hid under the skin. And then, right as the announcer's voice started building to a fever pitch, the A-10 made its entrance. The crowd let out a wave of noise, but the colonel just stood a little straighter, his fingers tracing the outline of that familiar silhouette in his notebook. You could feel something change in the air when the Warthog banked low, hugging the ground in a way only that beast could, and the colonel mouthed the technical jargon a second before the announcer did. The other pilots might have flown F-22s and F-35s, but the A-10 was a different breed designed to be ugly, tough, and impossible to kill. That's when something strange happened right at the climax of the demonstration. The aircraft peeled off the routine, banking sharply toward the crowd. The announcer's voice sputtered, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not part of the planned demonstration." The air got thick, everyone's heads craning up, wondering if they were about to witness an accident or something nobody had rehearsed. The colonel didn't flinch. He knew that plane, knew every quirk in the controls, every note in the engine song, knew that the pilot at the stick, Captain James Barnes, his own grandson, wasn't flying off script by accident. You could almost feel the recognition dawn on the old man's face, a slow, impossible realization. James must have spotted him in the crowd, somehow. Maybe it was a look, or maybe that notebook full of original blueprints that tipped someone off and sent word to the cockpit. As the A-10 roared overhead, it dipped its wings left, right, level the missing man salute. A tribute reserved for fallen comrades, performed right there, unannounced, above a sea of stunned faces. The crowd grew silent as the meaning hit them, teenagers falling mute, parents hoisting kids on his shoulders, even the announcer pausing to wipe his eyes. Suddenly, officers were moving in, whispers rippling through the air. One general cut straight through the crowd and saluted. "Colonel Barnes," he called out, loud enough for all to hear, "it's an honor, sir." For a moment, all the years dropped away, the disrespect, the aches, the loneliness of being forgotten. The teens who'd mocked him blushed, looking at each other, one mouthing, "Google him." Now, on the big screens, footage appeared. A much younger Barnes beside an early A-10, helmet under his arm, face bright with hope and fire. What happened next felt like a scene straight out of a movie. The crowd surged, but gave space. A young father brought his daughter back to the colonel. "Sir, would you mind explaining your drawings?" The old pilot's eyes crinkled. "I'd be honored, sweetheart." Kneeling with effort, he showed her the technical magic behind the cannon's mounting, told her about recoil, about saving lives. The girl hung on every word, her dad nodding, a look of pride spreading across his face. The Warthog finished its final pass, the demonstration now laced with extra flare-tight turns, slow rolls, all meant to make a point not just about power, but about legacy. When the engines finally wound down, Captain James Barnes taxied right up to the barrier where his grandfather waited. Cameras flashed, phones shot video, the crowd parting like the Red Sea as the old man and the young pilot locked eyes. James snapped to attention, saluted, then broke regulation and pulled his grandfather into a tight embrace. Yeah, that happened. Tears everywhere. Even the general got choked up. Then, as if the universe had lined it all up, a squad of veterans broke through the security line. They were Gulf War survivors, their leader trembling as he pressed a faded patch into the colonel's handed tribute they'd hoped to deliver for 30 years. "We all made a home, sir, because of what you built. Because you insisted on protecting us, no matter the risk." The colonel, usually a loss for words, just squeezed the man's shoulder, a lifetime's worth of meaning in that silent gesture. That wasn't the end of it. The airshow commander came running, urging Barnes to say a few words. Standing awkwardly at the mic, his grandson at his side, the colonel finally found his voice. "We didn't build the prettiest plane. We built the one that worked. That kept its promises. The real heroes aren't up Heratheory out there, coming home because this machine did its job." He looked out at the crowd, kids, soldiers, engineers, ordinary folks, everyone quiet, listening for the lessons behind the bravado. Afterward, the teenagers who'd mocked him waited nervously. "Sir, we're sorry. We didn't know." The colonel smiled, a little tired, a little mischievous. "No one ever does. That's the thing, heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they're just the guy with a notebook in his hand and a story nobody's heard yet." Later, after 1,000 selfies and 100 more handshakes, the family gathered around. The old man's cane left behind in his grandson's hands, forgotten in the glow of everything that had just happened. The crowd lingered, the conversation swelling about legacy, sacrifice, respect, and the truth that you never really know who you're standing next to. As the sun set, casting the Warthog in golden light, it wasn't just an air show, Anna Maria, it was a reminder. So let me ask you, since you've made it this far, who in your life deserves that kind of tribute, that missing man salute? Who's the quiet hero in your story, the one you'd never want the world to overlook? Drop your thoughts below, and maybe, just maybe, we'll all learn to see a little deeper, listen a little harder, and recognize the greatness quietly standing right beside us.